Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Spooky Alistair Stevens. Tonight we begin our modern horror unit, our horror unit, if you will, with David Sodergren's 2024 book, The Haar, a weird wee story set on the northeast coast of Scotland. And because this book is slightly more modern, slightly more provocative than our recent units, I want to take a moment to offer a content warning for some more adult language than we've been used to of late, some descriptions of body horror and injury, including blood, some misogynistic language and behavior, and some scathing contemporary critique, because that really is, I think, the heart of the book. What Sodergren is doing, and why The Haar is perfect as a modern horror text, is unifying the kind of splashy, slasher, gory kinds of horror stories of the 70s, the 80s certainly, with a kind of political positioning. I don't even necessarily want to call it a political critique. I don't even necessarily want to think of it as a political ideology as we begin to move through this book, but there is a politicized dimensionality to this book that I find bracing. And in order to fully appreciate that, we are going to have to delve into just a little context. We're going to do a little geography. We're going to do a little table setting right here at the beginning. We are probably not, for all that the reading for this week was extremely brief. We were supposed to read the first 10 chapters. I think we're probably going to call it quits when we get to the naming of our new friend, our strange new creature that we meet in the course of this book. But, you know, the book is a fast read. It's a short book anyway, and it's a fast read, so we're going to have no trouble covering out the rest of the entire run of the book, I think, in 2 weeks, which does, I should mention right up front, give us most of October left. I guess not most of October, but half of October, fully half of October, for perhaps another short horror title. Stay tuned for next week. We're going to have a new poll up next week to determine our next unit, because that's the privilege, that's the pleasure of doing these very short units, is that we're always looking ahead. We're always thinking about what is coming next down the pike. Let's, as I say, establish some context, some table setting here right at the beginning. And we're going to begin, of course, well, with a place that's very near and dear to my heart. If you are new to Stars and Swords, if you are new to my podcasts, then you might not be able to tell entirely from my accent that I was born and raised in Scotland. I spent the first 30 years of my life in Scotland, and in fact in the northeast coast of Scotland. So I'm very personally connected to the setting here of David Sodergren's book. This, as you can see, Scotland in all its magnitude, a little topographical map there. But what we're really going to be looking at in terms of the culture, the characterization, many of the assumptions that we're making, and some very specific history, some very recent and very specific history, we're really going to be focusing on, as I say, the Northeast. Now, what we mean by the Northeast of Scotland varies radically depending on who you are talking to. The most generous and inclusive kind of description of the Northeast is everything from Inverness there that you can see in the little crook of the Murray Firth there, all the way down to Edinburgh. That entire coastline from Elgin to Fraserburgh to Peterhead to Ellen to Aberdeen, all the way down past Dundee, past St Andrews, all the way down to Edinburgh, could conceivably be considered the Northeast. But when we're really thinking about the Northeast, we're thinking of Aberdeenshire. Let me zoom in here a little bit and give you a closer look at exactly where we are. Now, I grew up on the northern part of this map. I grew up in largely, Forres and Kinloss and Elgin, and Fochabers was where I went to high school, so I spent much of my life growing up there. I moved around a lot because my stepfather, I should say, was in the Royal Air Force. So I moved around a great deal, but always returned to that area. But we're not really looking at the Murray Firth coast. We are looking here at the far bleaker, far colder, far more challenging, but also in its way more ruggedly beautiful kind of northeast and eastern coast, which kind of runs, I suppose, from Fraserburgh down to Aberdeen. You'll see just south of Aberdeen there Stonehaven as well, which is extremely beautiful. Stonehaven has the somewhat dubious distinction of being the place that invents the deep-fried Mars bar, a staple now of Scottish culinary art. The people of the Northeast are hardy. Fishing is the primary industry for that whole area for the longest time, right? There is agriculture also. This is where your Aberdeen Angus, right, it comes from. That is where this is raised. But primarily, the infrastructure of that region for hundreds of years consists of small, relatively isolated fishing villages, kind of huddled in little crammed white houses in the crook of a bay or the declivity in an inlet there, just kind of hunkered down on the coast to try and protect themselves from the relentless North Sea wind. On average, in this part of Scotland, 1 out of every 3 days is rainy. In the winter, it's 1 in 2. It is beautiful, except for Aberdeen, the granite city, the silver city, so called the silver city because the granite from which Aberdeen is largely composed gleams silver in the rain, which it is always doing because it is always raining. Aberdeen is an eyesore of a city. It is an ugly, ugly city with some few very small exceptions. I'm going to show you a slide here just to indulge myself here. This, of course, is New Kings. This is one of the great buildings of Aberdeen University. This is where I studied. This is the building where I studied English and really fell in love, I suppose, with exactly the kind of critical work that we are doing right now. So I am rooted in this very specific place in a number of different ways, not least of all because of my education. Just north of Aberdeen, if we look back at the map, if I can in fact look back at the map, I'm not even going to try. This software is not reliable enough. I'm not even going to try looking back at the map, but we can fill in here the wee town of Balmeedy, which is the direct inspiration for Witch Haven in the Haar. Though Balmeedy, even now, even today, is larger than Witch Haven, it has a population of around 2,500. And I have to talk about some recent history, and this is going to be very politically charged, and I warn you that the next few minutes are just not going to be very fun. I've got no jokes for this. There's nothing fun about what I'm about to discuss because, well, you'll see, because Balmeedy gained national and international notoriety in 2006 when a large part of the ancient Meany estate were purchased for development by Donald Trump in order to create a golf course, despite the damage that many people predicted would occur to the 4,000-year-old Balmeeny sand dunes, an area of special scientific interest, right? Designated an SSSI, a site of special scientific interest. These 4,000-year-olds, geologically extremely significant sand dunes, were right in the firing line of the development of this awful golf course. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. And I was there while this was happening. I was studying in Aberdeen in 2006, 10 miles down the coast. So this was all very immediate and very fresh. Here is a glimpse, if I can call this up. The dunes. The dunes run for 20 miles or so north of Aberdeen. There used to be coastal walks all along there. You could really just walk all the way from Aberdeen to Fraserburgh if you were so inclined, but not so much now because they have been kind of blocked off, partly by the Trump golf development. Trump pursued personally and by proxy a typically aggressive campaign in local government and at the national level to secure development rights for what was claimed at the time to be a billion-dollar tourist destination. The Aberdeenshire Regional Council folded immediately, and in June of 2008, the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood in Edinburgh followed suit, rubber stamping the entire development. In 2009, Trump asked the local council to issue compulsory purchase orders so that he could buy up extra land in the area, including the homes of 4 families near the development. Upwards of 40 families had already been convinced or compelled to sell their land to the Trump organization. In 2011, curiously, interestingly, unprecedentedly, Trump claimed that he had never done such a thing, that he had never filed for compulsory purchase orders, despite these being documented events. Also in 2011, he filed a protest against the development of an offshore wind farm necessary for the energy future of the Northeast region because wind turbines are, direct quote, ugly. The lawsuit was dismissed, as was the appeal. Alex Salmond, the former First Minister of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood in Edinburgh, described Trump as 3 times a loser. End quote. During construction, Trump applied pressure to the Grampian police to detain and arrest local journalists and protesters. It is also alleged that the development hired local people to harass their neighbours and to silence protest. As a result of the development, eventually, the Balmeedy Dunes were irretrievably damaged and lost their SSSI status in 2020. 4,000-year-old dunes scrubbed clean of their significance. The course opened in 2012. It brought less than 1/5 of the promised investment to the local economy. It created fewer than 1/10 of the promised new jobs for the area. It has lost money every year that it has been in operation. Trump was convicted last year of fraudulently inflating the value of the development in order to establish collateral for additional loans here in the United States. And then in June of this year, a second course at the same development was opened during a 4-day private trip by Trump to Scotland, which nonetheless cost Scottish taxpayers in excess of £10 million and required 5,000 police officers to be pulled from their active duties to provide additional security. And that, I think, will do it. We're done. I'm not going to try to mention the situation again. I think just having this in our back pocket, because it is vital, I think, to establish how desperate and sad and satirical and righteously furious the Haar really is. The specifics have been, I was going to say exaggerated, but exaggerated is not the right word. They have been very slightly altered, but the underlying resentment is very, very real. There is basically, besides the obviously supernatural elements in this book, the political background is not fictional. It is very closely adapted. So the other thing, to pivot away from all of that and hopefully to never mention it again, the other thing that we have to establish is a uniquely Scottish meteorological phenomenon on the northeast and the east coasts of Scotland. From the middle of the spring to the middle of the autumn, occasionally we get a unique confluence of frigidly cold North Sea water and warm, moist winds blowing from the land out to sea, which combine into a thick, dense, freezing fog. That fog then tends to roll in off of the sea, sometimes coming miles inland in this weirdly sharp, delineated line of fog. You can be 100 yards away from the wall of fog, and it is a beautiful summer's day. You step into the fog, and the temperature will drop by as much as 10 degrees centigrade, which is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So it can go from literally an 80-degree day for our American friends out there down to freezing point. And the very worst examples of this phenomenon. It's bitterly cold. It is wet. It is clinging. It is clammy. Visibility can drop precipitously. It is a blinding, thick fog. And the name for it is derived from the Norse word for frost and or the Dutch word for a biting cold wind. The Scots word for this phenomenon is the Haar. Let me see if I can show you here. I've got this. To contrast with the dunes that we were just looking at, here is the uniquely soulless and weirdly beflagged development. This is the golf course right now at Balmeedy, which is just, we don't fly flags like that in Scotland for what it's worth. This is, demonstrative of a complete lack of understanding and respect for the local culture. This is an American flag that is flying here, right, in everything except its actual design. But to set all of that aside, let's take a look at, I've got two images here of a Haar. This is one of the most famous and distinctive. This is the Forth Road Bridge at Edinburgh. This is across the River Forth just north of Edinburgh. So this is a long way south. The Haars don't normally or don't as frequently come that far south, although they do even occur in northern England. They come all the way down to Yorkshire from time to time. So you can see there how thick it is and how it rolls in. The Forth Road Bridge, of course, a masterpiece of modern engineering. And I have another picture here. And if you're listening to the podcast after the fact and you'd like to see these pictures, the link to the slide packet is in the show notes as always. You can just go and click that link and kind of follow through as I go. I pulled this one out not because it is a particularly good picture of the Haar. You're not seeing that sharp delineation. I pulled this one out because this is the beach at Lossiemouth in Murray, where I used to live. I used to travel across that wee bridge over to the sandy part of the beach very frequently through the summer. There is a really world-class, just kind of behind the camera here, a little lower down because this is kind of on the top of the cliffside, but a little further down by the seashore there, by the harbour, there is both a world-class coffee shop and a world-class ice cream shop. Really fantastic places. This is Lossiemouth, as I say, in Murrayshire. So with all of that said, with all of this established, let's get into the book. And we're going to take a look at the very beginning of the book because then I want to kind of pull our focus all the way back out to look at how horror novels specifically operate, because we're dealing with a very different kind of text here. And even A different text from Dracula that we discussed last year, Bram Stoker's 1895 novel Dracula. We're looking at the advent here of modern horror in terms of Stars and Swords in our discussions, so it's going to be interesting to take a look at exactly how these books operate and how they achieve their goals. Let's get into our first slide here, from which we pulled the title. I guess not actually the title of this week's session. We'll get to the title in the next slide, but we introduce our protagonist. Muriel Margaret McAuley was 84 years old for the first. Was 84 years old the first time she saw a man turned inside out by a sea monster. You might think it would bother a woman of her age, but as Muriel was fond of saying, she'd seen a lot in her 84 short years. Most notably, she had been first on the scene back in '66, when the lighthouse lamp failed and the Charlotte Dane fishing vessel had crashed into the rocks, disgorging its human cargo into the bay. Muriel had witnessed it from her rain-streaked kitchen window as she scrubbed the dishes. She ran from the small cottage she shared with her husband Billy and waded into the sea, rolling up her pinafore and dragging mangled bodies from the pounding water. The rest of the fishing village of Witchhaven soon joined her in the rescue attempt. Some of the men they pulled from the icy sea were still alive. Some were dead, and others were in pieces. The next morning, Muriel had carted her trusty wheelbarrow down to the beach and collected as many parts as she could find. Legs, arms, feet, even a head had washed ashore. She left the wheelbarrow in the garden while she phoned the authorities, then made soup for lunch while waiting for the limbs to be taken away for identification. One of the things that I find most interesting here is how we situate Muriel in action. We're introduced to her name, her age, her gender by implication, and that is it. Then we see how she copes with a crisis. We get to see her in action confronting this duality of life and a set of dualities which are pressing and urgent and meaningful throughout the entire run of the book, right? There is not quite a chiastic symmetry, but there is a symmetry here between the very beginning of the book and the very end of the book, with, not to spoil anything, of course, this early in our discussion, but with Muriel leaving behind the safety of her domestic situation, right? She's in her home. She's doing the dishes, a more mundane and domestic task we cannot imagine, but she leaves it behind to venture out to the sea. And we're positioning the sea here immediately in a way that I think is probably quite familiar to many people who live on the Northeast. The North Sea is not a gentle sea. It is not a sea that laps at sandy shores. It is a sea that strikes at the land. It is a sea that is frigid all year round. There is never a time when it is warm. It is a sea that, for large expanses of the shoreline, crashes into rocky beaches rather than gentle sands. And it is a sea that carries with it a kind of treacherous danger. It is a sea of deep currents and riptides. It is a sea of hidden rocks, oftentimes very sharp rocks that you have to, contend with, and all kinds of marine life beyond, which of course is going to be one of the primary things that we're going to be looking at as we move through. So what I want to look at here in this opening slide, what I want to observe as it is being established for us, is this tension between the domestic and the wild, right? We have this very normal experience that Muriel has, coupled with this extremely unusual experience, right? This unprecedented experience. But I also want to focus on physicality, on matters related to the body. Bodies are extremely important in this text. And this is one of the things I think that really sets it apart from more traditional horror. This is one of the things that makes this text interesting as an example of modern horror, not modern in the true literary sense, right? We're not really looking at modernism in its kind of stripped down muscularity, and we're certainly not looking at a postmodern horror text. This text is self-aware, but it is not preoccupied with its own self-awareness. This is a text that is playing straight ideas that are in some ways very traditional, but is layering those ideas with deeper thought and with deeper consequence, because though bodies, even here, are going to be used as a means of delivering horror and gore and upsetting imagery, right? One of the things that people go to this kind of book for, the presentation of bodies and the way that we engage with bodies, the significance of the bodily form itself is vital. It is absolutely necessary if we're to understand what is happening thematically in this book. I have seen some criticism of this book. Many people love this book. This is kind of a cause célèbre right now. This is a very popular title. This is probably the most recent popular title that we've covered here on Stars and Swords so far. But there have been some pieces of criticism leveled against this book that kind of take issue with this idea of a superficial approach to gore, that it is not particularly substantial, that it is more concerned with being inventive. And I do think it is inventive, but I also think that it is substantial. It's just not substantial in the way that you might expect it to be if you're reading it just as a very mainstream, very kind of formulaic kind of horror novel. We're going to get into all of this. I'm not just, I'm not just setting this up so that we can come back to it at the very end of our session or anything. In fact, let's get into it right now by taking a look at our second slide with the introduction of the young woman sent by Patrick Grant to secure Muriel's home here. This is right after the young woman calls Muriel a fool for turning down the offer. I've been called a lot worse than a fool over the years, young lady. In fact, I think I've been called every name under the sun now by people I respect a lot more than you. And might I add, it's Mrs. McAuley, not Miss. The woman's eyes brightened. She was a beautiful girl, no older than 30. Muriel thought she would be best working her charms on men. What old buffoon could say no to a smile like that? Oh, you have a husband. Perhaps I should talk to him. I'm sure there must be some way to come to an agreement and end this unpleasant business once and for all. My husband has been dead for 12 years. The woman's smile lapsed, her lips eclipsing the brilliant white teeth. I see. He died in this house. The house he built, our house. And when he passed, God rest his soul, this land and everything on it became mine. I've lived here most of my life. My son was born here, and I will surely die here. But not before I'm ready. Muriel rose to her full height, all 5'2", putting her eyes level with the woman's flawless, blemish-free chin. And I most certainly will not sell to some torag from the telly so he can build a golf course and ruin a beautiful piece of land, no matter how many millions of pounds he has. I mean, I am perhaps, I presume, preaching to the choir here. Muriel is fantastic and one of the strongest protagonists that we have discussed in this entire podcast series. I think that she jumps off the page. She is so vivid. She is so rooted in her very specific identity and really it reads to me as an enormously accurate and affectionate and perceptive piece of characterization. So I really want to focus here on this representation of bodies. This is going to be spun out in the very near future, just in a few pages, into a much larger kind of thematic confrontation. But here we're already getting the idea that there is an authenticity to the bodily form, there's an authenticity to the bodily experience that can be challenged by inauthenticity, by the artificial, by the manufactured, right? We're given this beautiful girl, no older than 30. Muriel has already noticed her perfect teeth. We're noticing here her flawless, blemish-free chin. She is artificial. She has been packaged. She has been prepared, created in order to sell further creations. She is part of, well, the enemy in the frame of this book, right? She is part of the body of the capitalist beast. She is part of this monstrous machinery, which will oftentimes be represented by actual machines. But those machines, when we get them, as we'll get in, I think, even the next slide, we're going to see an example of those monstrous machines of development being positioned alongside the gears of that system, the men, the women, the human beings with their frail bodies, which are nonetheless machinified, right? Which are nonetheless turned into this corporeal capitalist enterprise. And one of the things that I really want to be thinking about as we move through, particularly as we move into next week's reading, I think the middle of the book is particularly rich in this regard. I want to be thinking about authenticity and inauthenticity, and I want to be thinking about the ways in which bodies are generative of truth. It's not just that reality or authenticity or honesty are anchored in our bodies. It is that the interaction of bodies, the interaction of corporeal forms, right? The interaction of the meat of us and the fabric of the world around us generates authenticity. I want to continue to keep that in mind as we go. This is also, to kind of take a different perspective on this passage and this entire chapter, in fact, a really brilliant way of introducing not just Muriel, but our central conflict and the kinds of dynamics that we're introduced to here. The Northeast coast in particular, these coastal communities, particularly once you get away from, the commuter communities just north and south now, I guess, of Aberdeen. Once you get out into villages that have stood the test of time, you are looking at some very impoverished communities. You're looking at places that have a real and almost complete working class history, right? There's no space in these tiny communities perched on the edge of Scotland's coast to allow for the development of middle-class industries, right? Particularly through the beginning of the 20th century, when so many of these ideas become fixed, when the world starts to move underneath our feet, but we cannot yet, in some of these locales, in some of these communities, accommodate that change as rapidly or as fully as we might want to, right? And certainly, there is a healthy chip on the shoulder of every person who lives in these kinds of communities out there on the Northeast. As I say, I grew up around communities like these, so I'm familiar with the fierce loyalty and interdependence of an independent community. These are people who do not, as Muriel's representing here, right? Muriel and the others who are still holding out, though they grow fewer and fewer, they are still kind of fiercely proud of their identities as individuals, yes, but also as this defiant community, which of course speaks to like the deeper parts of the Scottish cultural personality, the Scottish personal identity. We've labored for 300 years under the yoke of the tyrannical rule of the English, right? To kind of put the most Scottish independent spin on that I possibly can. But we must remember that the 21st century has not been a simple or straightforward time in terms of Scottish identity. We have faced, we get our Scottish Parliament right at the end of the 20th century that is established. Certain issues are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. It becomes an echo chamber of independence rhetoric that falters and then regrows and then falters again. We're looking at questions of national identity in the context of Brexit, and we're looking at questions of national identity in the context of internationally powerful billionaires coming to Scotland to ravage the landscape, ravage the countryside here. So that idea of a fierce and defiant independence is woven very much into the psyche of, I think, Scottish people in general, but certainly those Scottish people in the Northeast, especially out there on the coast where life is just a wee bit harder. Life is just a little more stern and a little more challenging. All the more beautiful for it, of course. It's not without its recompense, but a hard life there. Let's get back to our slides and take a look at this idea then of encroaching modernity here. So many lights. So much noise. The wilderness was disappearing, replaced by trucks and diggers and men in hard hats pointing. They were always pointing at something. Recently they had begun working through the night, pile drivers thumping relentlessly, mirroring the frantic beating of her own heart as she tried to sleep. They weren't supposed to do that, weren't allowed, but no one cared. The police, the town officials, the Scottish government, they all stood idly by, happy to accept Grant's money and look the other way as he ran roughshod over rules and laws. Apparently, laws don't apply to the rich. The barbed wire boundaries of the worksite enlarged every time she looked, edging closer and closer to her property. Soon they would be on her doorstep. She was glad Billy wasn't here to see his beloved Witch Haven trampled and ruined in the name of progress. Yet an old fool, she said, taking one last heartbreaking look at the men and the vehicles and the destruction they invariably left in their wake. She wondered if she had the patience to outlast them. She wondered if she still had the spirit. So again, right, this beast of capitalist expansion, the idea of the barbed wire boundaries of the worksite enlarging every time she looked, right, metastasizing all across the countryside, consuming, ravaging without any desire for symbiosis, any desire for harmony, any desire, any understanding of capacity, of satiety, of sufficiency. It will eat and eat and eat until everything else has gone. And you see here too, I think, the coordination here between the men, the workers, the people involved in this development and the machinery itself, kind of coexistent, kind of coterminous, right? Overlapping the one with the other. And of course, we're introducing here, in the most full way up to this point in the novel, that this is a beat that we're going to return to several times over the course of the first handful of chapters. The idea that perhaps Muriel just doesn't have the fight left in her. The idea that she is exhausted, that she has been defeated, that this is perhaps how lives end, that this is perhaps the ultimate fate that we get to, is just being exhausted by change, by progress, by land developments, by distant billionaires. We'll circle back to how Muriel kind of engages with her own mortality and her own desire for life, and other characters too. We're going to get a note here from Arthur in just a little while. In fact, speaking of Arthur, we move now into chapter 3. We get the excellent scene where we are told that this rebel alliance, as few in number as they now are, is growing ever smaller as, this fatigue and this disappointment, which I think is absolutely reflective of an echo of Muriel's own kind of more profound fatigue and disappointment, right? We're also seeing that here in these holdouts and these people who are defying the property development organization. And as I say, this is where we introduce Arthur, Muriel's closest friend, who we learn later has been in love with her for many years. In chapter 4, we get the return trip to Muriel's house and witness the destruction of her chicken coop. Before we know that the coop is destroyed, before we even get all the way back there, we have the first minor version of this interaction. This is a thing that Sodergren manages to pull off very deftly several times in the course of the novel, maybe more, right? A dozen times in the course of the novel, where he will give us a minor key version of a scene and then immediately follow it up with much more bombast, with all of those same chords played in a major key, right? We're getting a really powerful delivery of an idea that was just established. It doesn't quite feel repetitive. It doesn't feel as though we're necessarily building a pattern as much as he is demonstrating the enormity of the forces against us. We're going to stumble over a pebble and then stumble over a rock. We're going to, cross a stream and then have to ford a river, because that's just what life is. There's some innate adversity and a kind of recurring kind of adversity that we encounter again and again. And as I say, in this particular version, before we get to the house, before we see the destruction of the chicken coop, just as we're heading along the beach here on Arthur's tractor, we have the first version. We have the guy in the suit on the fancy ATV challenging them, telling them that they can't take this road, which is, and I guess specifically, right, demanding IDs from them, which is clearly repellent on the surface, right? It's just a superficial reading will assure you that this is gross and is an intrusion and is an affront and is uncivilized and certainly lacking in respect. But it is a particular affront to the Scottish, to someone who was living in this area, because long before the law was actually enshrined in current law, all the way in 2003, for centuries before that, we have understood in Scots law the right to roam, the right to explore, the right to go anywhere, to cross farmland and forest, to explore the country without fear of trespass. There's just, as long as you are being responsible in Scotland, you can go wherever you like. The rules of property ownership don't extend to walls and barbed wire fences and these kinds of things. So there is a specifically antithetical quality to being challenged on the open road and being asked for your IDs. Not a thing that I think anyone would be terribly comfortable with, but in this instance, a particular affront to Scottish people. And then we get to the actual confrontation, and if you're not immediately fond of Arthur, as I must admit I was, then I think this is the moment that does it. This is the moment that Arthur rocks up and brings a gun to a douchebag fight, which I really love. Oh, Elizabeth's saying in the chat, I like that. Right to roam, very different from the US. This is the thing, right? We're by the time the Scots are getting together and making like a system of laws, the land is populated. Everyone is here that is going to be here, right? We kind of have this sense that we come into a legalistic structure with the sense that this is a shared place and that stewardship of the land is important. There isn't a point in Scottish history to the point that, Scotland can be identified as a nation, right? As a unified culture. There isn't a point where we come into Scotland as a virgin land waiting to be exploited. That's very much an American phenomenon. And I think that the idea of packaging up property ownership is so fundamental to the idea of westward expansion, the idea of manifest destiny, right? These kind of founding myths, which are so enfolded in the ideology that it's hard to disentangle them from the roots of the country, right? It is hard to think about how Americans relate to the landscape. And by Americans here, I'm, obviously not talking about indigenous populations, but talking about the, everyone who is descended from an immigrant, which last time I checked was basically everyone. Their relationship to land, your relationship to land, my relationship to land, honestly, I've been here long enough, is enfolded in those ideas of ownership and of exploitation in a way, right? And we need to kind of challenge that ideology with some fully kind of developed and robust kind of post-colonialist, post-imperialist philosophy. We need to unpick all of that. But yeah, we had just by quirk of circumstance and fate, a very different kind of policy in the United States. And as I say, right to roam, though it was just an ancient understanding, is now legally enshrined, thanks to the Act in 2003. That is, your legal right in Scotland is to go anywhere you like, as long as you are behaving responsibly. And there are a few exceptions, right? Like you can't go too close to a prison. And I think there are rules about like schools have like a perimeter around them. You can't just cross like school grounds for no reason. But, when you're out in the wide open, you can go through a forest, you can splash across a stream, you can walk across a field, and no one can say anything as long as you are behaving responsibly. So let's get to Arthur here. And as I say, the bringing a gun to a douchebag fight, he unrolled a pristine sheet of paper and pointed at it. This here is your property. You'll notice that your fence and that thing we took down were actually on Mr. Grant's land. That's not true. You just made that up. That's not the map. The man smiled. Well, now, you better take that up with your lawyer. Money can buy a lot of things, said Arthur as he huffed his way toward them, but it can't buy decency. It can't buy compassion. And it can't buy a nutter with a fucking shotgun. Muriel saw the man's eyes widen, then turned to see Arthur heading over, his old farming shotgun raised. He cracked the weapon and slipped 2 shells from his pocket into the chamber. Now, listen here, said the man, backing up. The other workers had stopped, too. They glanced nervously at each other. No, you listen, you barrel of bollocks, said Arthur. You get away from this place and leave an old woman alone. He snapped the shotgun shut. Have you no shame? You're nothing but a bunch of bullies. I'll pause here just to give you all a moment to cheer. Kind of take off your shirt, run around the room, just feeling pretty pumped, feeling pretty good, feeling pretty strong about people standing up to bullies here in the defense of an old woman who just... I don't want to skip over this too much because the destruction of the chicken coop is graphic and ugly and brutal and cruel. This is absolutely an act of bullying. This is an act of intimidation. This is an act of, nice place you got here, it would be a terrible shame if something happened to it. And Arthur is meeting violence with violence, or at least meeting the implicit threat of violence with the explicit threat of violence, I suppose is where we are here. But it's wielded in a way that is personal, that is direct. He is not falling back on any kind of piece of paper, right? Particularly not a piece of paper that has been changed, that has been altered. Again, the machinery of the capitalist beast here revealing itself in its deception. As Muriel says, that's not the map. You made it up. There's no way that the rationale that you were using for this cruel, intimidatory action is justified. You're claiming that it is, but we're in different worlds now, right? But Arthur's immediate response is to be direct and to make this appeal as he's, holding this shotgun. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy decency. It can't buy compassion, and it can't buy a nutter with a fucking shotgun. How you feel about, the use of guns in this moment, how you feel about the use of the threat of violence in this moment, I don't necessarily think that we are supposed to understand Arthur to be entirely civil, right? This is not, as I said right at the beginning, this is not a tame part of the world. This is not a tame part of Scotland. This is not the gentle rolling hills of Murrayshire, where I largely grew up, right? This northeast corner here is sharper, it is flintier, it is more edged than the more gentle parts of Scotland. But there is here something in the claim to the right of violence enacted by the singular body in defense of the singular body, which again is more authentic, or at least has a claim to an authenticity, which the industrialized, corporatized, mediated violence by proxy that we see from the working men employed by the organization, the development organization. These things are very different. One is real and immediate, and the other is not. The machinery, the architecture here is terrible. Elizabeth saying in the chat, I saw a house torn down out my window once, and it was so violent and monstrous. The machine looked like a prehistoric creature almost. It was both mesmerizing and upsetting. Yeah, I've seen the closest experience I've had to this is suddenly while walking in the forest in Murrayshire, I crested a hill and came upon just some deforestation, right? There was just a logging operation. And those forests are managed by Scottish Forestry, right? So they will harvest, a few square miles of forest and then will plant it again and will take care of it and maintain it sustainably. But it is a brutal thing to witness as you have these giant machines grabbing the pine trees and just splitting the branches from them, just consuming them, almost viscerally consuming them, spewing out smoke. Yes, the stink of oil, yes, but also these shards of wood, the chips of bark, just leaving them on the forest floor. It is, the interaction of mechanized violence at that scale, even at the scale of the chicken coop, right? Let alone the scale of an entire house. It is something that is antithetical to us. And again, I really want to emphasize how the machinery is antithetical to the body. The body is soft and pliant. That the body is vulnerable, But there is something worse than that, which is the lack of vulnerability, which is the lack of this soft physicality, which obviously we're going to lean into once we meet our strange creature, which we'll get to in just a few slides' time, I guess. So we conclude this chapter. Muriel goes into her house, and we have another beat right at the end of the chapter with this patient acceptance of the possibility of her imminent death. She's not yet at this point even quite hoping for it, but the fact that it is there on the periphery, the fact that it is imminent, is a thing that is almost a comfort to her, right? She is almost accepting the idea that she won't have to fight forever as the world gets darker and as her physical body degrades to the point that more and more of her life experience becomes a fight. It becomes a contest. It becomes something that she has to accomplish rather than simply do. Let's, how many slides do I have left tonight? We've still got 4 full slides to get through. So let's, 5 even. I'd better pick up the pace here. Let's take a look at chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 6, and the introduction of the Haar here on this Dreich day. It was another Dreich day. The Haar, that freezing sea fog, lingered offshore, forming an impenetrable grey wall across the ocean. If Muriel didn't know better, she would have thought the end of the world had arrived. What lay beyond that mysterious Haar? She would never know. The Haar always came to her, and never the other way around. It crept inland, wrapping itself around her cottage before dispersing, taking its secrets with it. She remembered the seafaring stories Billy used to tell in the long winter nights by the fire, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his pipe in the other. Tales of strange sights and sounds, of harpies and selkies, of sailors driven mad, of boats lost at sea. The glass of water had filled to the brim and overflowed. Muriel inspected the glass for contaminants and, satisfied it was drinkable, popped some paracetamol in her mouth and swallowed them down. Life was a constant battle to preempt pain these days, and today the pain was winning. Sleeping in that blasted chair hadn't helped. So, as I said earlier, we're setting up this duality, this dichotomy, this conflict almost, though it is not by any stretch a simple conflict between land and sea. And I've seen, as I say, some criticism online wondering why this novel is in fact called The Haar. The Haar is not particularly important, right? This is not the fog or the mist. This is something slightly different. But I think that the reason that the Haar is as significant as it is can be found in exactly what we get in this passage. It is the bridging. The Haar is the thing which is free to move from one to the other. It is the product of both. It is the warm wind from the landscape meeting the frigid waters of the North Sea. It is created by both, and it exists over both. And it kind of, in its way, neutralizes both, or at least envelops both in the same way. We get the same kind of freezing temperatures. We get the same lack of visibility. We get the same feeling of isolation and of danger, whether we are on the land or not. The Haar transcends the landscape as it's presented to us under normal circumstances. And there is something bodily evident in that. There is something physical. There is something corporeal about its presence. We'll talk more about that when we get to it, I'm sure. Let's pick up the pace here just a little bit because, as I say, we still have some ground to cover. We learn very quickly that Arthur has been arrested, and then we're introduced to Patrick Grant via the TV. Grant, I think, is a little less successful. If I have a criticism of this novel, it is that our antagonist figure is a little straightforwardly monstrous. He is a little bit, which I understand I'm saying that here in 2025, right? It seems impossible to conceive of a man that can be too monstrous for, us to buy him as a real-life billionaire. But I think that, at least in his introduction, he is a little heavy-handed. I think that what we get from him toward the end of the novel becomes more, well, not emotionally sophisticated, right? But at least emotionally satisfying. We managed to kind of move the needle into a kind of melodrama, which sits poorly with Muriel at the beginning, who is so not melodramatic, who is so defined almost by her kind of robust and ground level approach to life, that this figure feels contrary to that, and I think that may well be the intention. I would not be surprised at all if what Sodergren was going for was something that felt intrusive, something that felt excessive, something that felt bracingly against context, right? Something that felt as though it did not fit into the world, a person who felt into the world. Let's get to Muriel thinking about Grant so we can talk a little more about this as I move back to my slide here. The great pile drivers bellowed their metallic song, laying waste to the ground. Men swore at each other through megaphones, the sound carrying all the way along the beach. Shielding her eyes against the breeze, Muriel stepped out of her garden and onto the coastal path, which once upon a time had been a popular walk for birdwatchers. The tide was at its highest point. Soon it would beat its lazy retreat from the shore, and not even Patrick Grant could stop that from happening. She pictured him standing on the beach, arms raised like King Canute, commanding the sea to halt. In her imagination, he wore an old-fashioned red and white striped bathing costume. The image made her smile, and for the briefest of moments, she forgot everything else. It didn't last. She thought about Arthur, carted off in chains on national telly, in unwashed jeans and a fraying sweater, and about how humiliated he must have felt. That's what Grant wants, though, to pummel us into submission. Nothing was off limits to men like that. He was the criminal, not Arthur, not any of the residents of Witchhaven, despite what the news said. He probably owns all the channels. Men like that, rich men with no morals, did whatever it took to get ahead. They lied and cheated their way to the top, treading all over the little people beneath them without a care. That was bad enough. But even worse was the way Grant treated the land. A man with no respect for nature was the worst type of man. She would never understand someone who could walk through Witchhaven and not feel their hearts sing. So if we haven't picked up on these underlying themes by the time we hit this chapter, well, here they are, kind of laid out for us, kind of presented to us as almost an encapsulated idea, though not without a little texture, not without some underlying ideas here. There are things in Muriel's understanding of the world which are not necessarily complete, that are not necessarily true. For example, right here, right? She's thinking about Arthur getting arrested, getting carted off on national TV, being made an example of in his unwashed jeans and fraying sweater, and how humiliated he must have felt. Well, later we will discover that Arthur didn't really feel that humiliated. He's angry, yes, and certainly the things which she is identifying, the unwashed jeans, the fraying sweater, those are not the things which would humiliate Arthur. Muriel is possessed of an incredibly strong perspective, and it comes through in the book. But Sodergren is positioning us very carefully, I think, to understand that it is an incomplete perspective. And even if you challenged Muriel on it, I'm sure she would be the first to say that she doesn't know everything, that she doesn't pretend to know everything, that that's for men more like Patrick Grant than it is for women like her. I wanted to call out here, as we're talking about the ways in which the body is consumed by the mechanism, the idea of the great pile drivers bellowing their metallic song, right? Starting and ending this passage with this idea of singing, the latter in exultation, in joy, in harmony with a beautiful landscape around you, but the former, this metallic, alien, intrusive, clamorous thing. So the great pile drivers are bellowing their metallic song, laying waste to the ground, and men swore at each other through megaphones, the sound carrying all the way across the beach. unnaturally augmented voices, that even the most like natural as we saw in the meeting of the naysayers, those who are withholding their sales from the development organization, swearing is a means of life on the northeast of Scotland, all across Scotland, really. But here, even that most basic interaction between working class men is mediated by this mechanical device. It is made larger than it ought to be. It is exaggerated, and it becomes intrusive. It becomes destructive to the peace of this place, just as surely as the pile drivers are. Contrast this, of course, with the sea that does come up, that it can be destructive, that can be hard, that can be, cold and brutal, certainly, but that it will retreat. It will beat its lazy retreat from the shore, and not even Patrick Grant can stop that from happening. There isn't really a conflict between the mechanism and nature. There isn't a war here, or if there is, it's a war that only one side can possibly win, right? Like Canute, the idea of development, the idea of enforcing your view on the natural world can only be a temporary thing. It can only be an act of utmost arrogance, of an overwhelming narcissism to believe that you can imprint meaningfully your desire, your will on the landscape at the large scale. I should point out here, this is a commonly misunderstood story. This is a commonly misunderstood fable here, the story of King Canute, who goes out to sit on the beach and command the tide not to roll in. And sure enough, it does roll in, and he is killed by it, right? He drowns in it. This is one of those things, it's kind of like Schrodinger's box, right? Where the story is remembered, but the lesson is taken the wrong way. Canute was demonstrating that he could not control the tide. He was demonstrating the lack of power that any man can have, even the king, right? And of course, this story is apocryphal, I'm sure, but as a story, we have forgot to take the right message from it, which is Canute is demonstrating no man has this power. Instead, we remember him as an idiot who thought he really did have that power. Hugh is saying in the chat here, I remember when we tore down one of our barns. When it was done, the pile of rubble looked like a dead thing. It was like we killed it, which I suppose we did. It's hard. It's so hard. And again, right, this is the contrary position. As we are ruminating here on the impossibility of terraforming the landscape at this large scale, of in defiance of the natural world, creating this manufactured thing, we can look with... I haven't pulled the slides, which is ridiculous of me. I absolutely should have pulled the slides to look at the building of Muriel's house, which is hand-built by Billy, right? It's kind of falling down. She can't quite take care of it. She can't get up on the roof anymore to replace the leaking shingles up there, or the tiles probably more than shingles on the northeast. Shingles can't cut it out there on the northeast. But she can't get up there to make the repairs, but it is still a loving thing. I remember that description of his chair that sits by the window that he himself crafted, that embraces her when she sits in it. It's not that we can't build things. It's not that we can't make things. It's not that there isn't a value in craft. All of those things are real. But again, we see it in this singular relationship between bodies. Billy built this thing, and so it is special. He built the chair so it holds her. It was intended for her. It's a very unique, specific kind of relationship. Unique in the sense that it is defined between two very clear points. Not unique in the sense that it is rare or singular. These relationships happen all over the place. These relationships are everywhere. We see kinds of echoes of that same thing between Arthur and his tractor. Even we might speculate Arthur and his shotgun, for goodness sake. Let's take a look here. Now that we have established the heart here of our ongoing conflict, the man with no respect for nature was the worst type of man. Not just because being destructive is bad, though it is, but it is because a man with no respect for nature does not understand himself. As Hugh says, beautifully put, craftwork is a way that we describe our interaction with the natural world. I love that, Hugh. Exactly. It is just another means of expression, right? It is just the same. We get that also. I wish I had pulled these slides now, because I'm finding them more significant this week than I thought we would. I thought we'd get a little bit into this next week. But when we're talking about Billy at home, that he has no time for art. Even though he has built this house, he has built this chair, he crafts things all the time. And he looks enviously at her watercolor of the bay that hangs above the fireplace, kind of seeing the significance of it and not understanding, and maybe Muriel by implication doesn't understand it either, that these are the same thing. This is just a means of humbly identifying yourself with your environment, with your immediate circumstances. It's a really beautiful thing. Maybe I'll pull that out. We'll talk about it in a little more detail at the beginning of next week. For now, though, we get Muriel approaching Rory's cave, this kind of classically magical place that where in the folklore, a sea cave is a very, very powerful thing. I'm going to talk a little about selkies and things like that next week. She's singing here the version of The Wife of Usher's Well, which is a very old, no one is really sure quite how old because of the oral tradition and the lack of records that those people kept, but it is first kind of recorded and attested by Sir Walter Scott in, I think, 1802, 1805, somewhere very early in the 19th century. Interestingly, this particular song also spreads into England, where it takes on an entirely different tune, and also spreads to Appalachia. It's very well attested in the eastern United States, again, with another tune. The story itself, the song itself, concerns the grief of a mother who loses her children. Her 3 boys all die, and she grieves to excess. So racked with grief is she that they return, and they ought not to. It's emphasizing this idea that there is a due and prudent term for grief. In fact, specifically, a year and a day. A year and a day is how long you should grieve for someone, and then you have to let it go, because otherwise you are holding them to this world and not letting them move on to the place that they are intended to be, whether they are unquiet in the grave or unquiet in the sea. We then get the very awful introduction of the coke-addled son of Patrick Grant, Connor, affecting the 1N spelling, which just an odious figure. I am not going to quote from this terrible confrontation itself, but suffice it to say, it really demonstrates, I think, with great deftness, just what a loathsome person he is. We're also, though, as we move toward the end of it, as Muriel, is struck as she falls, as she passes out a little, we're doing something very interesting that I really love in horror books, because before a horror story gets you to the point that it has kind of made its promise to you, before a horror story tells you what kind of story this is going to be, is this going to be a ghost story? Is this going to be a curse story? Is this going to be a time travel story? Is this going to be like a slasher story? What kind of horror is this? Before you get there, our sensitivity to horror and our sensitivity to the constructs and the conceits of genre cue us to look at everything suspiciously. It is entirely possible, I think, to read this sequence where Muriel passes out in the sand, and when she comes to, Connor and the girl have gone, to read this as an incredibly loaded, almost supernatural event where, oh my God, are Connor and the girl dead? I mean, they're not. They're going to come back later in the story. We're going to circle back around to them, but we take no time here to affix that in the mind of the reader. So everything becomes more loaded. And I want to kind of, I suppose, spend just a moment on this as we're thinking about the mechanisms of horror, right? We've established this world at this point. We've hinted that there might be something out there. We've introduced these ominous elements to the narrative, but we haven't yet introduced anything that is an outright kind of convention of the horror genre. We're about to, but we're not there yet. And in this moment, we might be thinking of how it is that horror stories work upon the reader. As we're sensitive, as we're prompted here, right? We've seen the gleam of the light out on the water, and we've had Connor and the girl disappear. We've had this act of violence. We've had the symbolism of Rory's cave presented to us already. So we're kind of in a place where we're ready for something weird to happen. And it's in this place that we are the most susceptible, and it's in this place that we are, I think, the most sensitive to one of the most unusual quirks of horror fiction. There are very few genres out there. As I've said many times before, for me, genre is a broadly misused word. It is broadly a word that is so imprecise in its definition that it has lost any ounce of meaning that it has ever had. For me, genre is most useful as a term, as a descriptor, as a kind of categorical classification when we use it to describe the experience of the reader. A romance story makes you feel like you are falling in love, right? That is why it works. That is how it works. It elicits that same feeling in the reader. A mystery story presents you with a mystery, presents you with the feeling of solving a mystery, crucially. Horror works on the reader physically in a way that most other genres don't so much, right? We get physical responses. There's a kind of sympathetic experience that you get when you're reading a text, where you will feel physically the emotional qualities that the characters are experiencing, the emotional qualities that the writer wants to elicit from you, and sometimes horribly emotional responses that the writer does not want to elicit from you. That's usually when you put the book down. But horror, like comedy and like erotica, live in the body. These kinds of stories live in the body. The response is a much more physical one. You are going to have a more physical sense of fear while reading an effective horror story than you will a sense of satisfaction while reading a mystery story, or a sense of dramatic investment when you're reading a thriller story, for example. Horror, comedy, and, for want of a better word, pornography all kind of function physically first, which is to say that if you don't feel the physical response to the text, then you might well argue that that is a bad example of that particular genre, that is a bad example of the particular form. If a comedy does not make you laugh physically, then in what sense is it a comedy? If a horror story does not frighten you physically, if it does not elicit from you that feeling of fear, then can it be said to be an effective horror story? And as I say, at this point in the fiction, at this point in this particular narrative, we are so sensitive. We are leaning in. If you are enjoying the book as much as I am at this point, you are leaning in and you are aware of all of this potential space out there. We might not know yet what kind of story this is. We might not know yet what to expect from it. And that's very dangerous. That is why horror stories tend to be a little more conservative with the kinds of promises that they make to the reader, a little more explicit regarding the kinds of promises that they make to the reader. The famous criticism of the world's most famous horror writer, Stephen King. I can't believe I'm an hour into this broadcast and I haven't mentioned Stephen King yet. The famous criticism of Stephen King is that he can't end his books. And we don't mean that, because all of his books, and I promise you they do, I've checked them. What is different about Stephen King, what is problematic about Stephen King, what people feel dissatisfied by when it comes to the work of Stephen King, is that oftentimes the promise that he makes you is not the promise that he keeps. The thing that is established is not necessarily followed through to its natural conclusion. Instead, there will be a pivot, there will be a twist. He will start telling you some other kind of story in the last chapter or two, right? People feel this way about The Shining. People feel this way about The Stand. I'll tell you, I feel this way about The Stand. I think The Stand is a really fascinating book until the very end. I think that the ultimate resolution of that book does betray the promise that is made by the lead up to that event, right? We are setting the stage in The Stand for this epic showdown between like a theistic good and evil, right? Like an absolute moral good and evil in the book. And instead, it turns out to be a parable about how evil is self-destructing. It's never the one that you think it is, right? And that is frustrating, but that is a consequence of the great strength of the horror form, which is this sensitivity. So I think that Sodergren, I mean, again, your mileage will vary with this. I don't know how you guys feel about this book. I am generally pretty satisfied with it, honestly, in terms of the promise that he makes. But I do understand the people who came in thinking, oh, this is going to be like The Mist, this is going to be like The Fog. The Haar is going to be directly significant and not just thematically reflective of what is really happening in the book. I get that. I get that complaint. But for me, this is my favorite part of a horror story, right? Is we're almost an act in and we're starting to feel the spaces where whatever is going to happen could be lurking. We're starting to sense the possibility space of the novel that is then immediately, of course, going to be contracted. Inevitably, it must be contracted. It should be contracted, because we're going to find out that it's not the 90 things that we think it might be. It's the one thing that it is. And that's okay. That's a naturally kind of impactful part of the process. We need that to happen, but I like this part too. Let's get to, let's briefly dwell then. Let's try and figure this out here as I'm trying to move quickly through tonight's material and getting distracted. Oh, Hugh's saying, I've been disappointed with the ending of a number of King's works. The most amazing premise and story, great characters, well developed, and then it fizzles at the end. I feel exactly the same way. I think that you can, for all that I'm kind of defending King, or not defending him, I suppose, but trying to offer a different perspective on exactly what is happening and exactly why he is so disappointing so often. I feel the same way. I think that there are only a handful of stories from King that really end in a satisfying way, and many other stories that just turn out to be, it's been telekinesis all along. It's been telepathy all along. It's been like a poorly defined kind of psychic thing that's going to nod at the Dark Tower mythology and then just get out of there. We will have to do a Stephen King here. We need to find like the paradigmatic King text that we can study here on the show and really figure it out, which is probably going to be The Shining, except that's very, very long. I'm a big fan of Salem's Lot, which I believe was his second book. I think that one really works and does kind of deliver an ending that I enjoy. But yeah, as Elizabeth says, to be fair, he was on a lot of drugs. Now, Elizabeth, he wasn't always on drugs. He was also drinking a lot for like a long time. He's, it is interesting to see how he navigates the various phases of his life. Certainly, I mean, you can, talk about the quality of his endings and talk about his commercialism, talk about his regressive boomer instincts. That's a drug, says Elizabeth. You know what? You're right. Fair play. I rescind my previous comment. Let's get onto this slide and see if we can wrap this show up. It was the great dichotomy of her existence. She adored the sea. She respected and admired it and could even wade out up to her shoulders, but being out there on a vessel, floating helplessly on the waves with no idea of what lay beneath? No, that was too much. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, which exacerbated the pain in her ribs. She winced and turned away from the water. She wasn't far from home now, where her painkillers and slippers and comfortable chair waited. Should she call for a doctor? By the time he arrived, she would doubtlessly feel better. No sense in the poor man wasting a journey, not when the price of fuel was so high, or so the news kept telling her. The light of the setting sun across the waves dulled, and she glanced to her right. The Haar was rolling in again. Funny, it was usually a morning phenomenon. But now, as nightfall neared, the fog blanketed the ocean, moving with alarming speed. If she didn't hurry, it would close in around her. And close in around her, it does. I think perhaps then what we will maybe do, since I've already been here for more than an hour and we're about to get to the creature, maybe we will hold out here. And as Elizabeth says, this is where I'm compelled to recommend Black Sails. Yes. Excellent. Very good. This idea of Muriel feeling caught, as the text very bluntly tells us, right? The great dichotomy of her existence. She adored the sea. She respected and admired it, could even wade out up to her shoulders, but being out there on a vessel floating helplessly on the waves. And what we're seeing there, I think, is an understanding of what is her domain and what is not, as well as, obviously, if you've read the entire book already, we're doing some foreshadowing here. We're doing some semi-ironic kind of sowing of seeds that will later yield a great harvest. But what I see happening here in terms of Muriel's psychology is this sense of belonging, is this sense of where she is suited, where she is compatible, where she fits in the world, which is another way of looking at a respect for nature and a respect for the environment, is understanding what fits and what does not. It's not a desire to dominate. It's not a desire to transform. It's a desire to see clearly, to live in harmony with, but also permit the harmony of the natural world around you, to understand how all of it fits all together. Let's wrap up here, I think, and yeah, we'll come back next week with the discovery of the creature. We'll talk about the naming of Avalon. We'll talk about we'll definitely talk about the career of Frankie Avalon, which is crazy, let me tell you. And then we'll finish all the way up to chapter 20. Let's take the longer route, and we'll try and get all the way to chapter 20 for next week's session, which will be, of course, next Thursday. I don't remember what the date is. It's the beginning of October. Next Thursday night, 9 p.m. Central, we will continue our reading of the Haar. If you have thoughts about this text, if you have read any other books by Sodergren, if you have recommendations, if you have thoughts on King, please do get in touch. You can find me at Stars and Swords Pod, on all the usual places. All the links to that and the links to the slides, including all of the pictures that we discussed at the beginning of tonight's session, can be found in the show notes. This has been great. Thank you, Hugh, for being here. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here. This has been an absolute pleasure. I'm really enjoying this book and looking forward to the next two sessions. And as I say, next week we will have probably an extra little poll going out for something to do around the rest of October. Maybe we can pick a Stephen King, but I don't think there's a good Stephen King that is short enough. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon is pretty good, and it's pretty short. But it's also not classic King. If we're going to do a King novel, I feel like we should do one of the big ones, right? Thank you so much. I will talk to you all again next week. As ever, thanks for listening, and take care. Good night, all.